No address on this letter, but I was living in South Korea, stationed at Camp Humphreys. I had been recording very composed and pointy, sometimes atmospheric, and always really quite experimental music on cassette using 4-track recording for about 5-6 years at that point. I'd heard the Prague and Limoges albums that Chris Cutler and Fred Frith had released after some duets concerts, improvisational duets concerts overseas. And I sent Chris Cutler via RER, Recommended Records, a copy of the cassette, which was called Youth in Asia. And a while later, it may have been as much as a year, I got this letter. And what's interesting is this is 20 years before I had an opportunity to perform live with Chris Cutler in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. This is our first interaction. And he wrote, "Dear Brett, greetings. Thanks for the cassette, and a catalog comes soon. The cassette I found too much without warmth and without air. Anger's not an unwholesome emotion. God knows there's plenty to be angry about. But I find ugliness and anger taken together too oppressive a mixture. After all, we are human. It may be a delusion, but we are capable of creative action. The protection of beauty is in the most dire environments, and of hope. To add to the garbage pile of modern politics is dubious. Even as a documentary type presentation. I found your cassette and writings unleavened by sympathy for the listener and reader. It's a blast, which can only batter more senseless the already pretty bruised emotions of its recipient. I don't like swastikas, even as art, or as a way to make a point." And this is an aside, I don't understand what he meant by that, because there was not a single mention of any kind of swastika, nor did a swastika appear on the cassette's cover art. So I don't get it. But anyway, I continue. "Truth is bad enough without fiction making it worse. And so, I'm sorry to sound so negative. I defend your right to do what you do, and appreciate the fact that, unlike most, you've actually done it. Sorry to be so tired and to scribble. I'm under big pressure and have to leave Britain in a few hours for some weeks. There's a mountain of problems to deal with before I go, and to forestall while I'm gone. Thanks again, Chris Cutler." The cassette that I sent Chris was all instrumental, and the music on it was composed using an old Dr. Rhythm drum machine, and this is pre-digital, so it was a drum machine that you could program, but the sounds that it made were made with white noise and brown noise and stuff, gates and stuff like that. Electric guitars, a couple of them, some homemade instruments, and a whole bunch of Korean percussion, and a hagum, which is a 2-string fiddle native to Korea, and a lot of percussion. So I suppose the only writing there would have been the titles of the pieces on that, the instrumental pieces that were on that cassette. After my wife and I moved to North Carolina in 1998, I started up a series of recordings where I was inviting people to do improvised duets. Again, rather inspired by the Chris Cutler records, as well as other things that I'd been listening to, for 10 years or so. And one of the people I met, his name was Ian Davis, very, very creative percussionist, used a lot of hand percussion, and he lived down near Chapel Hill in Carborough, and if I'm not mistaken, he was a pharmacist. That's how he made his money. And he had a nice home in a nice little wooded area out on the outskirts of Chapel Hill in Carborough, and on the back of it he had built a large additional space for the express purpose of performing and recording music, and it was a great space. And he began to host what he called soirees there, where he would invite people in to perform what I would call difficult music. And Cutler was one of those people. Ian and I had been doing some recording together. In fact, he'd traveled up to record with me in Eden, and he got in touch and he said, Chris Cutler's coming here to play. Would you like to be a part of the performance? And I said, oh hell yes. And ended up driving down. I said, what should I bring? He said, bring anything you want. And what I brought was my banjo, which is a homemade instrument where I combined parts of an old Silvertone banjo with a pressure cooker, a couple of mid-neck high bridges, which split the strings on it, the two strings on it, into halves, and hence it became quite like a koto or a kayagum, and it had a couple of contact mics attached to it that could run off to amplification. And it was an instrument that I used to try to get to the kind of places I used to listen to when I was over in Asia, listening and watching traditional musicians. And so anyways, I got to Ian's house with it. Very excited. I was very, very excited, because this was one of those few occasions where I was going to be meeting, and better than that, making music with someone who was quite a hero to me. I'd been listening to Henry Cow and Art Bears and all that kind of stuff for a long time before this happened, and had written reviews about them in magazines and stuff, and it was just kind of a dream come true. There was a kind of a little hang and chat that preceded the musical performance, and during that time I was introduced to Chris. Very nice man, very, very friendly, soft-spoken. You could tell right away that he was a listener. He immediately seized upon the instrument I was carrying and asked me all kinds of questions about it, and said he was looking forward to hearing what it sounds like when we play. And then shortly thereafter, when everybody had a couple glasses of wine in them and some cheese and stuff, we went back into the music space and had a performance back there. And I got to play on two occasions during the evening. Played the banjo both times. Ian, hand percussion and some small drums, a bassoon player, and Chris Cutler and me. Cutler had a modified drum kit, very unique and interesting looking and actually perplexing, and some kind of a table around one side of it on which he had all sorts of things he could grab and make sounds with. And I spotted right away that there was one of those beautiful Reed Ghazala homemade, kind of like synths, a circuit bent instrument. I could see it. Looked like it had little glass eyes on it. That was cool because I'd sent Reed a whole bunch of broken electronics that I had. I asked him if he could use any of that stuff, and he said probably, and I sent him a box of that stuff. I don't know if it ever ended up in any of his stuff that he invented after that. But anyways, it was lovely. We had I think the first improv might have lasted about 15 to 20 minutes. And then I stepped away, and there were other people playing with Chris and Ian. And then later on, I came back up and did a shorter thing, maybe 8-9 minutes near the end of it all. And we had mics all over the place to record everything. Ian did. It was just great. And I ended up making that fairly long drive back home, 2.5 hours or so, late at night, just full of energy and all kinds of post-gig thrill, as it were. That was one of the really most enjoyable, call it a pickup gig, phone call. And it was lovely. Oh, and I should say that I met Ian Davis because he was part of a large improvising ensemble. I think they did some structured improvisation that was called the Micro East Collective. And I had received a Micro East Collective compact disc to review. I was doing an online independent music service, I guess you could call it, reviewing independent music. It was called The Unheard Music back then in the early aughts, 2000 through maybe 2005. And I looked at this huge list of personnel on this CD and noticed a couple of members of the band Dr. Nerve in there, including Nick Dudkovsky, who's the composer in that group and guitarist and stuff. And Nick and I had been involved in a couple of things, a fundraiser compilation disc that I put together to try to replace rusty basketball hoops and backboards and stuff at the school I was teaching at, which worked. But then there was this Alice Cooper tribute album that came out, and I sent Nick an electric mandolin version of the song I'm 18, and then he went out and interviewed a neighbor kid that he knew in New York City on the subject of the anti-hero, with Nick talking about people like Alice Cooper and the younger man talking about some graphic novel and comic book heroes pre-Deadpool that were anti-heroes and stuff. And we ended up on that Alice Cooper comp together with that, me and Nick and that boy back then. So anyways, I spotted Nick's name on that Micro East Collective CD, got back in touch with him, and I got in touch with Ian, and I said, hey, this is really cool, you guys working together and stuff. So that's how I met Ian, and this performance with Cutler and friends and Ian and the bassoon player was sort of the culmination of that weird 1 or 2 degrees of separation thing that happens in the arts, where you know one person, you meet another person, and all of a sudden unexpected doors begin to open up, with a weird kind of synchronicity. So anyways, there's my big talk on Chris Cutler. He and I have completely fallen out of communication, like I tend to do with people. As I move on to new things to do, projects eat me up. I find myself not making a lot of phone calls and emails and stuff, which you can fault me for. There's only so many hours in a day. But anyways, thanks a lot, Chris. Appreciate the straight talk in the letter. I continued to make music that some people would consider to be angry, and I suppose I do to this day, although it isn't that kind of harsh, and I'm going to call it post-Henry Cow sonic expression that I was doing back then. Anybody who knows me knows that Bret Hart and swastikas are oil and water, and those two things are never going to appear together in anything having to do with me.